Hi, I'm Jared. In this short video, I'm going to show you how you can use the ePrep to create a simple workflow using internal standards. There are a few good reasons to use internal standards, but essentially you will get a better data outcome when using an internal standard method. I think there's been a move away from this technique in the past few years, and I know the precision of the injection by the autosamplers has gotten a lot better, but typically that does worsen as the injection volume decreases. I think one of the major reasons labs don't tend to use internal standard methods anymore is that they are very labour intensive. So if you have 50 samples, each sample has to be prepped with internal standard addition. So in this demo, I'm going to show you how you can set up an internal standard workflow through the ePrep tablet software. Then we'll see the ePrep in action executing this workflow. So let's get started. We will start by creating a new workflow by selecting New. And in this workflow, the first thing to do is we will add a diluent to each of the vials. We do this so the needle can be dipped in the liquid to ensure complete syringe droplet removal for subsequent additions. For each of the steps in this workflow, we will add a task group first, then select the task and add it to the task group. The reason we do it this way is that all the tasks within the task group will be executed on all the output vials before going on to the next task group. This is the most efficient way of carrying out this workflow. So for example, the diluent will be dispensed to all the vials before going on to dispense the internal standard to all vials consecutively, and so on. This technique minimizes syringe changes and syringe washing. After the diluent, we'll add an internal standard task to the workflow as part of a task group. Next, we shall add an aliquot sample task to the workflow. We shall put the original samples in a rack and then transfer an aliquot to a 2 ml vial. The tasks are carried out specifically in this order for efficiency, so the internal standard solution will be added to each of the vials and the needle will be dipped below the level of the diluent. Because this is done before the sample is added to each of the vials, the syringe will not require washing between internal standard dispensers. The syringe will require a wash between sample to sample transfers. For example, an aliquot of sample will be transferred from a larger container to the 2 ml vial, and then the syringe will be washed before the next sample transfer. And then finally, we are going to make the vials up to volume, so we shall add that task to a new task group. So you can see how very quickly it is to select all our tasks needed for the workflow. We will now fill out our workflow by selecting the syringes for each task and also the volumes to use. For the first task, we are going to add 300 microliters of diluent to each of the vials. So we select a 1000 microliter syringe and enter a value of 300 in the diluent volume field. For the internal standard edition, we will select a 100 microliter syringe to add 75 microliters of internal standard solution to each of the tubes. For the aliquot sample task, we will select a 1000 microliter syringe as we're going to be aliquoting 200 microliters of each of the samples to the output tubes. But just to see what would happen if we forget a step, we shall not enter the aliquot amount at this stage. And finally, for the make-up to volume task, we will use a 1000 microliter syringe and we are going to make the volume up to a final volume of 1000 microliters. So to recap at this point, all our tasks have been chosen and the syringes required selected, and the volume of the liquid has been associated with each of the tasks. So now we'll choose our input and output containers. We start this process by firstly setting up the deck by selecting the diluent tubes. To set the deck up, we select Configure Racks. In this workflow, we are only going to use 3 racks. One to contain the diluent, one rack to contain the samples and the internal standard solution, and the third rack will contain the output tubes for our finally prepared solutions. Our deck is empty at this stage, but we will drag the jam container rack into position 2 to use for our solvent diluent container. We'll then drag a Ballack rack into position 5, which we will use both for our samples and our internal standard container. And lastly, we will drag and drop one of the vial racks into position 9. You can see how easy it is through the drag and drop feature to select racks and add them to the deck. Our racks are now in place and will accept those changes. The next part of the process is to nominate the actual containers to be used and the starting volume if that is applicable. The first dispense is diluent, and for this we will use 2 reagent jars. In each of the jars, the starting volume will be 50 ml of diluent, which will be water. When we accept these changes, you can see now that these jars are associated with the first task as the input vials. This connection of the input containers with the task occurred because we started this container process by firstly selecting the input tubes for the Add Diluent task. Next, we'll select our internal standard tube, and this will be located in the middle rack in position 15. So we select that location. Then select that position to both start and end at. We will have 30 ml of internal standard solution, so we enter this amount in the software and accept the changes, and then select. And then this appears as group 2 associated with the internal standard task. We will continue this process by selecting our sample tubes by clicking on Select Sample Tubes. Our sample tubes will be placed in the Ballack rack in the first 5 positions. So we'll choose Start at 1 and End at 5. And then accept those changes, and you can see now that these appear associated with the aliquot sample task as group 3. Finally, we will select the diluent container from group 1 for the Make Up to Volume task. We now have to define our output tubes, and these will be 2 ml vials located in the deck at position 9. So we select one of the output tubes, and the 5 vials will be located in positions 1 to 5. So now we have to find all the input and output tubes and return to the main screen. You can see there is a red tag associated with the aliquot sample task. When we select Errors, you can see the reason is there is no volume set for this task. So we shall fix this and set a volume of 200 microliters. Now all the tags are green. Now that the workflow has been completed and we have green tags on each of the tasks, and again this shows there are no conflicts and all the syringes match the volumes required and all the required volumes have been set. It also means there is enough volume in each of the containers to carry out the workflow and that all the input and output containers have been defined. We will save this workflow and give it a name of IntStand Workflow, short for Internal Standard Workflow. And select Save. We're now ready to run, so we'll choose Run, and you will see that the deck is displayed, showing each of the racks and the allocated containers. Once you have checked all the syringes are in place and the containers are all set, we can start the workflow by choosing Press to confirm and continue. We can now see the ePrep in operation. We won't see the whole workflow here because it will take too long, but I'll point out some of the steps that we'll view. We pick up the workflow near the start after the ePrep check has been completed. This check ensures all of the syringes, racks and containers on the ePrep match those specified in the software workflow. The syringe will firstly aspirate solvent from the solvent jars and then dispense into the first 3 vials consecutively. This occurs because we have specified 300 microliters of diluent using a 1000 microliter syringe. So to optimize the workflow, the ePrep automatically works out the best aspirate dispense protocol. The next part of the workflow review is the 100 microliter syringe has already been taken and 75 microliters of internal standard solution is aspirated and dispensed into the first autosampler vial. And the final part we'll watch is 200 microliters of the first sample is aspirated and dispensed into the first autosampler vial. The syringe is then washed at the washing station before the next sample. That's all for now. I'll see you next time.